guys, and welcome to our author and our case study. Meet Cornelius Tacitus. The question marks because we're not sure about his first name. Maybe Aulus? So this is a politician and a trial lawyer of the very, very late 1st, early 2nd century CE. So he's active in the 110s, 115s or so. This, however, is one of his first written works. We think this was written in about 97, 98-ish CE. So we're right at the end of the 1st century of the empire. And we're dealing with the consequences of what we talked about in the first couple of lectures. That is, the reforms of Caius Marius and the political pickle caused by the ballooning power of the Roman general. So this is 200-ish years in. Tacitus is writing about his father-in-law, a general named Agricola, who was active under both Nero and his successors and then Domitian, which is a succession of very difficult bosses to work for, shall we say. This concentrates on his second term in Britain and his governorship of Britain as a province. He's working for the Emperor Domitian, who is a complicated figure. We can't quite get into this at the moment. Suffice to say that in the 170-ish years or so since Marius's reforms caused the powers of the Roman general to balloon and allowed them to build gigantic fan bases, there have been some unintended consequences. First and foremost, as I said last lecture, Rome is no longer a republic, an elected quasi-democracy, but rather it's now a kind of hybrid system under an emperor. So the emperor has the final word. There's still a senate. There's still some democratic processes, but by and large, we have a rule where the buck stops at an autocrat whose power grows out of this generalship directly, in fact. Marius's nephew, a guy named Julius Caesar, manages to use his military success, his rabid fan base in the army, and political shenanigans to gain control of the state. And although this ends in stabby death for his heir, Augustus, the power is able to stick around long enough for him to leverage it into creating the office of the emperor. So by the time we get to Agricola's term in Britain, this is in the 80s CE, now under Domitian. Domitian is ruling in a dynasty that got its power in a military coup. We're going to talk more of the details when we go to Jerusalem in the next unit. And the dynasty knows this, right? So Domitian is fully aware that his generals can build their own power base, turn on him, march on Rome, and do their own military coup. This means that if you're a general operating during this time period, you are under constant surveillance by an emperor who is waiting for you to rebel. And this means that you have to constantly be thinking in all of your command decisions about keeping the emperor from having you killed for treason. This is a hostile working environment, yes? I think we'd all agree with this. And it's the immediate consequence of Marius's reforms, really, because it was felt to be necessary that a general in a field still have all of these powers. Now the emperor was responsible for getting soldiers their retirement package, so the commander-in-chief kept that. But when you're in the field, living in your camps, isolated in a province, your general is more of your god king than is your emperor. The general decides how many times you get beaten a day, whether you get paid, how much you get paid, who's watching the payroll, how much loot you get, what your day-to-day functioning is going to be like, how much of the activities you engage in on a daily basis to stay sane remain allowed or not allowed. We'll get into what that looks like when we move on to the day-to-day details in Rome and Britain. So your general looms large, and generals are aware of this, and they're constantly having to play this balancing act where either they crack down and they get a tightly running unit that wins success for the emperor and keeps the general in work, but the general doesn't get so popular that the emperor gets jealous. Or they try for popularity. They break rules to make their men's lives easier. They overlook men's raiding activities, thus causing more unpopularity than already exists between Romans and the people they are currently oppressing. And this then gives the general the option to, say, run a military coup, or at least kind of not have as many day-to-day headaches cracking down on people. These are not command problems that go away, but they do have an immediacy and a lack of oversight by modern standards in the field. This is a time when Romans are beginning to create military rules and infrastructure in order to mitigate some of the pressures that come from making command decisions and managing your unit as a social structure. But it's a really hard position to be in. And Tacitus's Life of Agricola focuses on that problem from the point of view of Agricola. So Tacitus isn't disinterested here. He really loves his father-in-law, and you can tell from the way he talks about him. So keep in mind, this isn't just a third-person disinterested account of the facts of Agricola's life. This is somebody who loves him and is really strongly on Team Agricola, telling you why Agricola is the man. However, one of the things we can do when we read the life of Agricola, and what I'd encourage you to do, what I'm going to have you do on the final essay test, is I want you to think about what Tacitus is saying from the mindset of one of Agricola's soldiers. And what this lecture, or lectures, I haven't decided if I'm going to split it yet, is going to do for you is give you an idea of what it feels like to be Joe Roman legionnaire. Think about that person, his life, his unofficial family, his community, and think for yourself about what having Agricola in charge of your life would feel like. What would you like? What would you not like? And why does Agricola have to make the changes he makes too? Because Agricola inherits someone else's command, which is one of the strategies Roman emperors are using to keep generals from getting too cozy in their positions, is they'll kind of move their generals around the board, but the units stay in the same place. This is meant to break the kind of loyalty between general and unit that can lead to a military coup, but it also means there's some instability as your generals change when you're in the field, and you're there for 25 years or life, away from your home, far off in the frozen north. At least this unit were in the frozen north. The guy Agricola replaces, Tacitus accuses him of lax discipline. And to spell out what is meant by lax discipline, this means not policing where your men are every second of the day, letting duties slide, letting them have creature comforts and local connections that they technically aren't allowed to have, like unofficial wives or relationships with local people. Unofficial families are another thing people would have. So that's the kind of cozy stuff that Roman soldiers would have to make themselves not hate their lives in the field. On the other hand, what would happen if a general wasn't keeping tabs on the troops is they would go beat up the locals and take their stuff. They would rough up local people in some very distressing ways. One case of this led to a rebellion that Tacitus discusses in the Agricola. This is Boudica's rebellion. Roman soldiers raped her daughters and raided her people's lands as actually, no, I'm not going to excuse this. Roman soldiers did this. And because there was so much simmering resentment on the part of Britons who had to live day to day with Roman soldiers beating them up and taking their stuff and making them pay taxes, one of the things Calgacus says that I find really striking in his speech in your reading, this is the Britannic chieftain who leads the final stand at Mount Gropius. He says, the thing that's so messed up about the Romans is not only do they oppress you, but they make you pay for your own oppression, which is true. Romans would roll into your province, extract taxes from you, and then use that tax revenue to further take control of their newly conquered territory. I guess it's sustainable, but that's all I'm going to say in its praise. This causes great resentment, and that's an understatement. Britain continues to have problems with occupation all the way through the years of Roman habitation and control of Britain. Some locals do come up with ways of being okay with it. Some have to choose to collaborate, some choose to resist, but there's a school of thought that's becoming more and more vocal and thinking about Roman Britain that points out when the Romans left, average per capita quality of life goes up. People seem to be healthier, happier, partly because they're no longer being beaten up for tax revenue. So all of this I'm saying because the dominant narrative for Roman Britain has been like, yeah, Romans took over Britain, but it was really good because Britons got civilized and there were all these amenities, and the Britons actually kind of liked it after a while. And this is, I'm sorry to say, patently untrue. Regularly, for the centuries of Roman occupation in Britain, locals try with varying degrees of success to break off, including there's this one point where the governor of Britain rebels against Rome and then makes it his own like Roman fiefdom, which is nifty. So all of this is to frame why I'm making you read what I'm making you read for this section and giving you some context for everything I'm going to tell you about the situation on the ground in Roman Britain. So that said, let's get into it. By starting before the beginning of Roman occupation, I want to introduce you to Britain in the Iron Age, Britain pre-Rome, because there's this misconception that before the Romans showed up, Britain was undeveloped, right? That everyone was just kind of mumbling by without any kind of culture or civilization, which is really messed up if you think about it, but you will hear people say this on documentaries without a touch of irony. So let's look at this, shall we? Before we do, though, here's a timeline just to kind of orient you to where we are. These are the emperors active a little bit before and a little bit after the Agricola and the time of Tacitus's writing. Claudius is the emperor who invades Britain, so that's what I've started with. Julius Caesar did raid, but Claudius makes parts of Britain an official Roman possession. He brings elephants to Britain, which is kind of a boss move. Very nifty. So we are on this timeline here, Domitian. And just for your reference, so you know where we're going, we're actually going to backtrack a little bit to talk about the year of 4 emperors. So here's where we're going to end with the fall of Jerusalem. We're doing this in this way because Britain and Judea provide 2 very different but very complementary locations to look at how the Roman army was used by the Romans and what it was like to be on the receiving end of the Roman army. And we're doing them a little bit out of order just because it's easier to talk about Marius's reforms in the context of Britain. So that's the method behind my madness. We'll see how this works for us. Okay. So here we are in 43 to 47 CE. This is Claudius's invasion map, and this gives you a sense of who's on the ground when Claudius comes in. Now, we call this an invasion, but it's more complicated than that. A local faction in Britain, the Cativolani, are allies of the Roman people. So this idea that Roman Britain, or rather Britain pre-Rome, was not in communication with Rome at all is silly, but I have to say this because if you've seen the Britannia Amazon series, they make it look like one day they look up in their boats and they're like, Romans, where did they come from? No, that's nonsense. Much like that show. So many opinions, so little time. All right, so the Cativolani are Roman allies and friends. There are other groups on the island of Britain that are also Roman friends. So this is part of how Rome deals with border nations, is it creates alliances, it has programs where the sons of groups outside of Rome can be sent rather to the city of Rome for education and for networking. It's not quite the hostage situation we were talking about with, say, Polybius. It's a little bit more friendly, sometimes not. It's really on a case-by-case basis. And then the Romans will provide aid and money and trade deals for locals in exchange for cooperation and collaboration with Rome. The problem with that is that eventually, sooner or later, Roman involvement ratchets up to the point where we find Claudius in 43. So the Cativolani ask, maybe Rome offers and the Cativolani can't say no. It's a little ambiguous here. But the Romans send, under the guise of foreign aid, their legions, along with the emperor, into Britain in order to collaborate with the Cativolani against the Cativolani's internal enemies. Because, like pretty much everywhere else in the Mediterranean and greater Atlantic area, Britain isn't a political unity. There are various ethnic or tribal groups related by language, custom, religion, kinship, that are not acting as political unities. They're making, drat, that's my father calling. I'm so sorry. I'll be right back. And we're back. All right, what were we talking about? Yes. In fact, you will see right up in here. Let's use red for this. These are the Iceni. That's where Boudicca's revolt has its epicenter. So Boudica goes down and burns Colchester, while the current governor, so this isn't Agricola, but the current governor is over, let's see, here-ish, trying to take out the Druids. More about them in a minute. What we're looking at here is a diagram of an excavated road in Britain. So this is the Sharpstone Road, and this is typical of roads in Britain. Why am I talking about roads, you may ask? Well, the standard narrative of Roman occupation in Britain is that one of the things that Romans do for you that's a plus is that they build you roads, they build you infrastructure. And indeed, Romans did spend a lot of time building roads in Britain specifically, in part because you needed really good paving and reliable roads in order to maintain the infrastructure of a garrisoned island, as Britain is, where there's very thick military occupation in this area. However, Romans don't build these roads from scratch. When we excavate underneath Roman roads, so the Roman level is, let's see, right here in the yellow, scribbling on it in red right now. So underneath that, you'll see the Iron Age road, which is heaped up in a curve. That's a feature, not a bug. This causes rainwater to move off of the road surface, thus preserving the surface and keeping it in functional order. And it's deeply rutted from wagon traffic, quite wide. Like, it's a good road. And the fence posts on the side are another feature. This allows you to drive sheep efficiently, because if you have barriers on the side, the sheep don't wander. And then under this are more and more layers of road. The point being that even though Britain isn't a political unity, it does have infrastructure before the Romans show up. Pretty darn good infrastructure too, because just because Romans aren't running your island, it doesn't mean that you aren't making your habitable areas nice and aren't investing in trade infrastructure. Because even though there's not political unity, there is political cooperation. There are alliances, trade agreements, and there's a war, yes, between these areas, but there's also day-to-day relative peace and cooperation. And although there isn't political unity, there is cultural unity. There's shared religion. Religion in this case is Druidism, named after the priestly class running at the Druids. And with that culture, a very rich and old culture that does manage to survive in parts through Roman occupation. So that's one thing. So the Romans aren't building from scratch. The Romans are overlaying Roman infrastructure on top of existing infrastructure. And some of the Roman infrastructure is there to make Romans feel comfortable and not necessarily a sensible solution to the building challenges posed by Britain. For instance, Romans put in a lot of stone buildings that then need underfloor heating in order to be livable, because Mediterranean architecture gets very cold in an English winter. Just saying. So here's what houses looked like before Rome showed up. Now, these may look like unsophisticated huts. You'll hear even less nice words used to describe these. That is a mistake to call them this. These are very efficient, very sustainable structures. So the British roundhouses, sometimes they're built with stone, but often a combination of wicker and daub, or wattle and daub. This uses hazel twigs, which grow fast and plentifully and easily, but when they cure, they dry in a flexible but very strong, very long-lasting structure. The mud daub put onto it creates an insulating layer that keeps it cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And because it's made out of a combination of clays, mud, sometimes dung too is put into this, which may sound gross, but we're talking like cattle dung, which when dried is pretty hygienic, and also a very good insulator. All of this together, I mean, yeah, it's really quite flammable, but really easy to rebuild. The thatch on the roof is also a very good insulator. There's a fireplace in the center of the building, which means that heat is distributed evenly and efficiently. The fire is kept away from the most flammable part of the building. And then the thatch keeps out the rain, but it's permeable enough that the smoke can get out. So it's not an air quality hazard as much as you might think it is. These can be quite large and quite grand. So even though to our eyes this doesn't look super sophisticated, this is a really great way to build a sustainable, affordable, and comfortable place to live. So much so, in fact, that modern eco building is moving back to these kinds of construction materials in order to make sustainable and energy efficient housing that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. So this is kind of low-key brilliant. And these roundhouses are put oftentimes into hilltop fortified areas. So these are fancy people's houses. Now we also find these off of hillsides, and pretty much everybody's living in some version of this roundhouse. So this means that although there's income inequality, it's not huge income inequality. And depending on how you view income inequality, this might be a slightly more civilized way to live. I'm just saying. Comfy houses are something that you can build with materials that you can get out of the landscape pretty darn easily. So I'm just saying this is not a horrible way to live your life. And these areas were occupied generation after generation. The fortifications around these hills are also pretty efficient, sometimes also with some stone. Uh, However, when we look at them more closely, they don't seem to have been built just for practical defense. A lot of them aren't that practical as a defense structure per se. We also have some evidence that they were built year after year, generation after generation, as a way of keeping adolescents busy. What they do look like is super impressive. So these aren't so much about practically dominating the landscape in a warfare adjacent way. Rather, this is about creating a visually impressive psychological domination of the landscape. These hilltop fortifications, we think, were the seats of power for the various chieftainships around Britain. And chieftains might not necessarily have one of these. We think they may have traveled from one to the next in order to maintain contact with their people and to administer the areas under their control and their protection. So this is not inefficient. This is not uncivilized. This is effective. So effective that it takes Rome a minute to work their way through the island of Britain. This is not an easy conquest. This is hard won, and won only with local cooperation from people who thought that they could get one over on their neighbors by siding with the Romans. I don't recommend that as a lifestyle choice myself. Just saying. So in order to understand what's going on with Boudicca's revolt, we need to talk a little bit about pre-Roman British religion. And to do that, we need to talk about the Druids, which is difficult because our information on the Druids is not the best. So here's the very short version of Druidism. This is an excerpt taken from Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, which irritatingly is one of our best sources about what Druids believed and taught. I won't read the slide to you, but essentially it's a religion that works around an idea of human reincarnation, that souls are recycled, the ancestors are us, we are the ancestors, and that according to Caesar at least, this makes you more brave because you don't die so much as you restart, like Mario or something. Now, I am being cautious about this because Caesar is saying this to Romans in order to rile them up against the Druids. And in fact, the Druids are one of the few religious groups that Romans decided to go after. Why? Why were the Druids one of the few religious groups Romans decided to eradicate? Well, I mentioned that Northern Europe in general, and Britain in particular, isn't unified politically, but they are unified religiously and by a very organized religious group. The Druids were based out of the island of Britain, more specifically Wales, in the mountainous territory that was very difficult for Romans to penetrate in order to hunt down every single Druid that ever Druided. They had their own networks of communication across Northern Europe and Britain especially, and they were very authoritative. They were involved in the judicial system to some extent. They were part of a network unifying and brokering peace deals and trade deals amongst the various factions in Britain. So Romans knew that in order to conquer the Druid world, they had to conquer the Druids, which is why they were Roman enemy number one. And this is also why the governor of Britain and his army were off in Wales hunting down the Druids when Boudicca's revolt broke out. That is, they thought that it was more important to go kill all the Druids than it was to hold their recently conquered and deeply aggrieved territory. So that's one half of the Druid equation. But I should also talk about the other part of Druidic religion, the part that Romans used to drum up anti-Druid sympathy, had to do with the Druidic practice of human sacrifice. For a while, there was doubt and denial amongst modern historians as to whether or not Druids sacrificed human beings, in part due to some Eurocentric nonsense, this idea that, no, Europeans would never be so uncivilized as to kill people, or rather, human sacrifice people. Yeah, they did. We've found the bodies. Here are some of the receipts, although, mind you, this particular site isn't tied to Druids per se. So this is Ribemont-Saint-Cré in Brittany, so this is northern France near Belgium. And this is a site where a defeated army was found beheaded. So all the heads are missing and their bodies were set up on this rack on the top of a hill. So whenever you came into this group's territory, you would have seen this display of the bodies of their enemies. We have found sites that seem to be ritual as well. So swamp sites, sites with water, with bodies that show signs of what appear to be ritual killings, although not evidence of the one practice that stands out in Caesar's account of Druids, where he alleges that Druids officiate sacrifices where a giant wicker human form is filled with live human beings and then set on fire, and then all of the humans burn up. It makes a great horror movie, not the Nick Cage one. Look for the one in the 70s. Wicker Man, great movie. Alas, not a great source for Druid religion per se. Now, some human sacrifice does seem to be going on, and it does seem to be a normal part of religion in Northern Europe writ large, even outside of specifically Druidic contexts. Indeed, it continues to be practiced into the Middle Ages by polytheistic groups. But Romans should really check themselves a little bit, because Romans also have human sacrifice-like things going on in their religious architecture, like gladiators. Gladiatorial games were sacred to the god Neptune, the god of the sea, and although they included horse races and other kinds of things, they included enslaved people being forced to fight, sometimes to the death, not always, but often. Gladiatorial competitions were part of the religious framework. And this is why the state would pay for gladiatorial competitions and dedicate them to various gods in the memory of dead members of the imperial family and such. They came out of funeral games, but they were in a religious context. Romans make a big deal about how, we do animal sacrifice, not human sacrifice, and that makes us more ethical. But these are the same people who, if not invent, popularize crucifixion. So that's an interesting hill for Rome to choose to stand on. But I need to bring it up because it's part of the Roman anti-Druid rhetoric. They tell other Romans and the Britons that they're conquering that, no, your religion is barbaric. We don't force people to die for the gods. We are an ethical, better alternative. And Britons are kind of like, okay, well, you've conquered us, so here we are. Suffice to say, there are problematic aspects to Druidism as it was practiced in Iron Age Britain, but we need to hesitate a little bit before utterly denigrating an entire religious system. In part, because it's unclear whether the context in which human sacrifice took place involved consent or not. Some of the medieval human sacrifices coming out of Northern Europe involved people willingly volunteering to die for the community, which is a very different thing than what Caesar describes, where prisoners of war are collected up and then killed en masse, which is even weirder because Romans do that too. So, like, is it better or worse if you're bringing the gods into that? It's just a question. At any rate, it's not like Druids were killing human sacrifices every hour on the hour, day after day. This was something that was an emergency measure in times of great stress, and even Caesar himself says it's based on this principle that if you want to pray for human lives to be spared, you can't just give the gods an animal sacrifice, so the Druids say. Rather, if you want a human life, you need to give the gods a human life. It's kind of an equivalency balance sheet. And they have a point. Like, I'm just saying. Just for the record, I don't do human sacrifice myself. Nor do modern Druids, as far as I'm aware. Druidism, by the way, still a live religion, still a living tradition with changing rituals that survived despite great persecution and many attempts to eradicate it. So I know some of you are Druids, so hi Druids, you are valid. I see you. And I'm not accusing you of human sacrifice. So next up, let's talk about the chariot. I teased at the beginning of this class that chariots in warfare continue to be a thing in Britain until 500, well, they arrive in 500 BCE. They continue to be used effectively into the early 1st century CE. And we need to talk a little bit about what Britons do to make the chariot continue to be combat effective. In fact, one of the things that happens when Romans go to invade Britain, in fact, Julius Caesar, when he manages to get onto British soil, almost immediately is driven off by Britons in chariots, and he's super freaked out by it. He's like, what? Chariots, warfare? How do we deal with this? It had been a minute since Romans had to deal with battle chariots. And the kind of chariots used by the Britons were special because they were very small. So all of the anti-chariot tactics that you use with large horses don't work quite so well when you've got pony-drawn small chariots. This, by the way, is the Chariot Burial at Wetwang. Unfortunate name, but that's what the place is called where this thing was found. And this is not the only semi-complete chariot to be found in a burial from Iron Age Britain. It's a pretty complete one, though. Because of the way the soil is in some places in Britain, it tends to preserve wooden and cloth artifacts a lot better than other places. So this is a really nicely preserved chariot. You can in fact see this archaeologist on the side is removing one of the metal rims from the intact wheels. And this was found with the charioteer still in place and the horses were in the bearers. The whole thing is there. So we can reconstruct a British chariot like the Wetwang Chariot pretty darn well. Let's see what this looks like. Behold, a reconstruction of the Wetwang Chariot. And you can see already some very brilliant innovations that have been made in the many centuries since we last checked in with chariot tech. Starting with the suspension system, if you look at the bed of the chariot, where the charioteer and the warriors fighting off this platform are standing, it's not attached to the chassis of the chariot. Let me use blue here. Rather, there are these bowed pieces of steam-bent wood with braided thongs attached to them, holding the platform suspended. So this is a literal suspension on leather, which is going to cause a lot of bounce and give. So the platform free floats above the wheels, not resting on the chariot bow either, although the chariot bow is still if you look at it here, it's a rectangular socket. So we're still using that rectangular socket that we saw the Egyptians using. It's just a shorter, more compact vehicle with smaller horses, which means this thing can turn on a dime, kind of like my Honda Fit. Oh no. Oh no, Mr. Baby. Bedtime's not going well. I swear, dude! The Druids aren't coming for you. Okay, pardon me for a second. It's gonna be one of these nights, isn't it? Okay, I think we've dealt with the monsters in his closet, but only time will tell. Oh, right. What else did I want to say about this chariot? Yeah, so some of this isn't... Yeah, yes. So the wheels, you'll notice, have more spokes than our Egyptian originals. We've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, 12 spokes. So we have a much more stable wheel over boggy, uneven terrain, which is what we need. And it's not as springy, but it doesn't need to be as springy because of the way the suspension works, which means you can make a much more robust wheel, less prone to tipping. And because this whole thing is closer to the ground, you also get a lot more stability. So this is really a performance vehicle, so don't let the size fool you. Smaller is sometimes better, and this is one of those situations. So let's look at some experimental archaeologists taking this for a spin. Oh, well, first we have a museum model. Rather fanciful. Our warrior is getting a little bit overly enthusiastic and making some interesting choices here. Look instead at this coin. So this is a coin showing a British chariot with the two ponies. You can see the charioteer seated, and then you have a spear thrower not sitting on the ponies, which is a silly place to be, but rather back in the chariot box with a shield. So you still need to have a driver, and you still need to have some kind of ranged weapons expert, but the two in combination are still a classic for a reason and working out well. One reason why I do like this model is that you can see Iron Age British hairstyles. So one of the things that really freaked Romans out about Britons is that, to start with, they were already quite pale compared to Romans, and this lack of melanin tended to make Romans think they were looking at ghosts, especially coming out of the British mist. You'd have this swirl of mist, and then out would come this pale dude, and then they'd make it even more stark by putting a combination of chalk and kind of waxy, resiny product in their hair. So this guy's hair, it's white because he's put chalk in it, not because he's blonde necessarily, although blonde Britons do exist, just not a ton. British people during this period, by and large, were pale, yes, but with dark hair, like, well, yours truly. That's if the name didn't tip you off, I'm very, very Welsh. At any rate, so this product would be used to spike the hair out into this spiky big configuration, sometimes also in combination with blue woad body paint. So this very otherworldly kind of appearance, to Roman eyes, wild and distressing and kind of freaky. Romans were a bit legit afraid of Britons for all sorts of reasons, a lot of them involving Druid phobia. But also the headhunting. You'll notice that our charioteer has a stylish severed head attached to the chariot box. That's not fanciful, that's a thing. Northern Europe, writ large, especially areas practicing Druidism, did do headhunting. This was a way that you displayed your prowess in battle, and you'd hang the heads from your battle gear, especially if you were some kind of a mounted warrior, a charioteer, or a cavalry person. The heads were your calling card and an instrument of terror. We do find these severed heads all over the place in Iron Age Europe. So that's a thing. as promised then, we have our experimental archaeologists taking out a modern pony chariot reconstruction for a spin. And you can see all of the wonderful innovations here in practice. Looking, they kind of look like battle hobbits. I love this entire concept. Now, the wicker on the side may look like a less than effective way to armor your chariot, but it's a great idea. Wicker is light, but when made of the right kind of materials, it's very tough and durable, and it can trap arrows before they get to you. And when you're inside a wagon box, it's a good way to go. It's not that heavy, so you're not going to weigh down your chariot box. So this entire contraption allows you to whiz in and out and in and out of a battle multiple times to make volleys against the enemy or to just trample at them. You don't have to be that high to effectively trample. And this made Britons super intimidating on home turf. This is one of the things that Rome does not grab onto and try to weaponize themselves. The battle chariots final moments occur when Rome finally takes over Britain, but they're really nifty and worthy of our respect and attention here. I legit want one. This is cool. All right. So a note about the final sections of Tacitus's Agricola. So Agricola's predecessors rather, because they're so focused on the Druids, they aren't paying as much attention to what's going on in the already conquered areas of Britain. So when Agricola hits soil, one of the things he does is he tightens up discipline. And this means both getting soldiers to stop beating up the locals as much and stay in their camps more, but also redirecting their energies northwards to conquer more land. This is one of the constant problems Rome has to deal with, is you keep your soldiers busy by getting them to conquer more land, but then you have more land, and bored soldiers who have to hold down the land create problems because military police can often create friction in an area over a long period of time, especially Roman military police who are not being adequately supervised and who are allowed to loot frequently. While you weren't allowed to loot on the regular when you were acting as military police, sometimes it was difficult for soldiers to remember that because they were allowed to loot sometimes but not allowed to loot other times, and sometimes it's hard to remember when the loot light is on and when the loot light's off. So at any rate, Agricola marches into the north, and this is a map by date of where he gets when. He does make it all the way to the very northern end of Scotland up near the Hebrides. We think Mount Gropius here somewhere. We're not sure where this place is, where Tacitus sets up his epic face-off. Tacitus frames this as a last stand of free Britons against Roman oppressors, which is interesting coming from a Roman. He gives the British resistance the good speech. Agricola's speech is not that memorable. Calgacus's speech is one of the most ringing disendorsements of imperialism ever in literature. And it's interesting coming from Tacitus, which points to something that Romans themselves are beginning to have discomfort about. Namely, they're asking themselves, what are we doing by conquering these free, independent people who are doing just fine without us? Like, is this okay to do? Are we actually destroying something that shouldn't be destroyed? Because, like, in this particular instance, Tacitus is imagining the liberty of Britain in contrast to Agricola's horrible working conditions. Agricola isn't a free agent. He's working for an emperor who's a real jerk nugget, at least in Tacitus's mind. But at the very least, Domitian is a bad boss, not a particularly popular emperor either. And one of the problems Tacitus as an upper-class Roman is dealing with is, yeah, we've got this empire, but it's making us expend all these resources. People are getting killed, and we're bringing other people into this really toxic environment where horrible people get to be in charge because they just happen to inherit the imperial throne. So everything that we want to be, strong, independent-minded, free people, we actually aren't anymore because emperor. And the people that we're conquering, they are free. Like Calgacus isn't answering to an emperor. He sees his people being oppressed and he can stand up and make it stop. And Tacitus, as well as other Romans, are not unsympathetic to this. They actually quite respect resistance, even as they're putting it down with extreme prejudice. And that's an interesting thing for us to sit with as historians. It's not just Britons who are bothered by this situation. Romans also are seeing some ethical problems here. Kind of cool. Now, this may look like this is the moment where Rome conquers all Britain. It is not. After this campaign is over, Agricola gets called home to Rome. According to Tacitus, it's because Domitian is like, no, you're being too successful and now I'm insecure, so I'm just going to yank you off of the island and put you back home. And then Agricola ends up kind of dying unhappy in exile, not able to do his job, and feeling unappreciated, which is sad. But also, this undoes everything Agricola has done. So from the point of view of Roman imperialists, this means that all of these lives lost in this campaign up to the north of Scotland are pointless because Rome immediately cedes back down below the territory of the Brigantes, and they don't manage to hold territory north of that for a bit, not until Hadrian's Wall kind of solidifies a border. Rome continually tries to take the entire island and never quite manages to do so, for reasons we don't need to get into here particularly. But this points out a problem in the command chain in the Roman military. Rampant distrust makes Roman generals operate in a no-win scenario, where success ends up getting the emperor mad at you. Failure ends up getting the emperor mad at you. So, like, how are you supposed to do your job in that kind of toxic workplace environment? Let alone the toxic workplace environment where you have to beat people into marching with you to conquer bits of Britain that you may or may not get to keep. This makes people unhappy, in much the same way that in modern warfare, when people are asked to fight over territory that they then leave for reasons that aren't necessarily immediate to the military situation on the ground, that is a hard thing to sit with. It destroys morale amongst your troops, amongst your leadership. It ruins confidence in the government, and it causes an underlying disease both inside your empire and with people who have to live in the world that your empire exists in. This also undermines trust with your foreign allies and neighbors and creates hostility that then goes on to create more wars for you to deal with. It's toxic. It's a bad idea. So, like, don't run your empire like this, maybe.